We're going to look at a page out of the life of Jesus. This fourth chapter of Mark's Gospel could be called Christianity 101. Jesus is talking about having faith. He's trying to teach his disciples what does it mean to have faith. It starts with, on that day, Jesus put them in a boat, said, let's go to the other side. And I'd like you to catch up a little bit. Where have they been that day? Jesus has been teaching. He's been giving them lectures on faith. But you know, you don't really learn faith. You don't grow your faith in a lecture mode. You don't learn about faith in church as much as what you do tomorrow. You get a little bit of a instruction, but then you have to put it into practice. And our practice, what is practice? Problems, difficulties, challenges. You know, think James. You know, persecution develops endurance, pain and suffering brings, growth, and it results in peace. And so the peace of God, which is a fruit of the Spirit, the peace of God, which is often a gift that we desire, comes through this curriculum, if you will, of, it's time to test. How did you listen? How are you doing? And so Jesus is teaching through the fourth chapter of Mark's Gospel things like parables. The parable of the sower. The disciples are there in the front row, and there's other people listening in as well, and everybody ends in the same place, though. He who has ears to hear, let them hear. And the disciples are like, did you guys get it? No. They're looking at each other like, no, we didn't get it. And so Jesus dismisses the crowd, pulls the disciples in. You can ask all the questions you want. And they ask their questions, and you kind of have this feeling they still didn't quite get it. You know, Jesus is like, well, just come along, and you go into the parable of the pearl of great price, the parable of the mustard seed, and this is the kingdom of God is coming. And the question always is, do you have faith? Do you believe? But again, you don't learn faith by listening. It's as we mix it up on Monday with whatever comes, the challenges, the problems. And I think Mark would have us know the storms. When a storm comes, that's your test. And Jesus ends the whole thing calming the waves, and he says, do you still have no faith? We talked about faith all day. We're here in a storm. This is your test. And they kind of fail. Mark's gospel is going to a group of believers who are also in a storm. The Roman church, the Church of Rome, were early believers in a time of great persecution, pressure, and testing on them. Mark is the first gospel. And so it's being sent to a group of Christians that are being very much tested. It was a dangerous time to say, I am a believer in Jesus Christ. You could lose your life very simply in Rome. And so it's a book to say Jesus was also in a time where there was desperate people, where there was oppressed people. Jesus, in the context of his day, the Roman Empire was there in control in Judea as well. The Jewish people were the community of faith that was kind of out of sorts. You know, God, if you were really with us, you'd throw off our oppressors. God, if you're really here, you'd take away the Romans. And yet God didn't do that. Jesus came, stepped into human history, and said, God is with you. God is here. I represent God. God is on the move. And yet the Jewish community, God had become distant because they were in this time of suffering. God was, kind of out there or not as close as they remembered the stories in the past. And yet Jesus came to say, God is here. Emmanuel, God with us. So Mark's story goes, we're going to get in the boat, we're going to go across the lake, we're going to go into kind of foreign territory. The disciples are not always comfortable when Jesus says, hey, let's go over there. They didn't have a good time in Samaria. They didn't necessarily have a good time when he went into the Decapolis, and this is one of those adventures, but the disciples are a little bit out of sorts. They're rowing the boat, but they're not wanting to go where the boat is pointed. It's not Jewish territory on the other side. It's unfamiliar territory, and that's always a challenge for the disciples, spiritually, emotionally. And then this storm comes on the Sea of Galilee, and it's physically overwhelming them to the point of they're not sure if they're going to make it, the purposes of God. So this storm has more than just it's hard to row and make any progress. The storm is symbolic in their cultural mindset of somebody's out to get us. Somebody's out to get us. We know the disciples half of them are pretty professional fishermen. They're seasoned on the water, but it seemed to be too much for them. They come to the end of their strength, the end of their resources. They're not able to see their way through this storm. And the boat is full of fear. That's often where we get caught. There's a storm, and if your boat fills with fear, that adds to that sense of, oh no, my boat's going to sink. Fear is hard to throw off. Jesus is asleep. For whatever reason, Jesus is totally relaxed. He's exhausted from the day of teaching. He's asleep, and it doesn't say this, but there's probably a couple of disciples pitching their lunch over the side. Everybody's crying, and they're fighting over the oars, trying to figure out how can we get through this. And then somebody says, Jesus, don't you care that we're going to drown? Jesus is resting in the confidence of, I am God's Son. I have the power of God available with a word. But he's asleep. And the disciples feel like we're on the edge of that abyss. It's all going to end. How did we get from Jesus on the mountaintop, the glory of God, and now we're going to drown? I don't know about you, but sometimes my hard moment, my darkest moment is not that Jesus is gone, but that it seems like he's asleep. He's right there, but he's not doing anything, or at least not fast enough to help. It's not that God is away, but God's right there in the boat, and they're still sinking. And so they have this really desperate moment, and they wake Jesus. Jesus stills the storm with a word. He rebukes the wind and the waves, and there's calm. And then there's a new fear, like, wow, we didn't know this about Jesus, that he could do that. And there's kind of an awe. It's an awesome fear. It's this awesome revelation of, wow, okay, now what? So two things I take from this story is that when you think your boat is sinking, Jesus is in the boat with you. Jesus is in the boat with you. The second thing is storms all end. They may be longer than we wish. They may go on and on and on, but the storms do end. They do end. Peace is a part of our relationship with God. But you really have to hang on when your boat is in a storm.